The morning air at Fort Braxton was biting, crisp enough to sting the cheeks of soldiers standing at attention on the parade grounds. Frost shimmered over the neatly lined formations like tiny diamonds catching the pale sunlight. The usual clatter of boots on concrete echoed across the base as soldiers shuffled impatiently into position, their breaths visible in the cold air. Among them stood Captain Alina Ward, her dark hair pulled tightly into a bun beneath her standard-issue cap, her uniform crisp and precise, yet she moved slightly slower than usual. She had arrived just moments before roll call, the lingering effects of a recent medical clearance making her movements cautious. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to meet the eyes of the soldiers around her. Her chest tightened slightly, not from exertion but from the tension that had been building every morning since her transfer from overseas. Most of the unit didn't know her well. She kept to herself, focused on her duties, quietly determined to prove her worth. Then the sharp, authoritative voice cut through the morning chill like a whip cracking. Ward stepped forward. Alina's head snapped up. She had been expecting scrutiny eventually, but she had not anticipated such immediate attention. Colonel Harrison Briggs, a man whose reputation for strict discipline was nearly legendary across multiple Army bases, was already striding down the line toward her. His posture was rigid, his jaw tight, and his eyes sharp enough to make even the most confident soldier feel exposed. Colonel Briggs stopped in front of her, towering slightly over the captain. "Captain Ward," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "it seems you're having trouble keeping pace with your comrades. Care to explain why you're late to formation?" Alina swallowed, her fingers tightening on the straps of her gear. "Sir," she said evenly, "I have medical clearance that allows me to participate in PT at a modified pace. Modified pace," Briggs barked, cutting her off mid-sentence. "In my army, we don't make allowances for anyone. Excuses won't get you out of running with the company, Captain. You will fall in line like everyone else, or you will answer to me." The words reverberated through the formation. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, some suppressing smirks, others hiding worry behind stiff salutes. No one dared to intervene when Briggs chose to publicly berate someone. It was the colonel's way, a test of character for everyone else watching. Alina didn't flinch. She kept her posture straight, her face neutral. Inside, her heart thudded heavily, not from fear but from frustration at being misunderstood. She had not asked for special treatment, had not sought pity. All she had wanted was the chance to perform to her best ability within the limits of her recovery. "I understand, sir," she said quietly, her voice steady but firm. "I only request the chance to speak with you after formation about my medical clearance. I can assure you there is no intention to shirk responsibility." Briggs' gaze narrowed, studying her. For a moment the colonel said nothing, and the soldiers held their collective breath. Then he laughed, an abrupt, sharp laugh that cut through the tension. "Speak with me after formation, huh? I'll tell you what, Captain. I've been in this army long enough to know when someone is trying to pull a fast one. I don't tolerate excuses in my company, and that includes you." He gestured dramatically toward the line. "Fall in, now." Alina nodded, eyes forward. She stepped into line, the familiar weight of her backpack pressing against her shoulders. Every step felt deliberate, every motion measured. She refused to show him that she was rattled, that her body, recovering from injuries no one fully understood, protested against the cold, the exertion, and the scrutiny. As formation continued, whispers began circulating among the soldiers. "Who is she really? Why is the colonel so mad at her?" "She's new from overseas. Something happened there, that's all anyone knows." Rumors are a curious thing on a military base. They spread fast, fueled by half-truths and the imagination of bored soldiers. Alina could feel the eyes on her as she performed the morning exercises, each push-up, each stride during the run a reminder that she had to prove herself silently. She moved deliberately, careful not to overexert herself, but maintaining the appearance of full participation. By the time formation ended, her muscles ached in ways her comrades did not. She quickly collected her gear, her mind already rehearsing what she would say when summoned to the colonel's office. Sergeant Diaz, a seasoned soldier with a reputation for being both empathetic and blunt, approached her quietly. He had been watching her closely all morning. "Captain," he said, lowering his voice, "you could have told him about your injury. You don't have to hide it. I've seen what those scars do to a person, the kind you can't explain." Elena shook her head slightly, offering a polite smile. "Some things aren't for proving a point, Sergeant. I don't need his approval. I just need to serve effectively." Diaz nodded, impressed by her composure but clearly uneasy. "Just be careful. The colonel doesn't do second chances easily." Elena didn't respond. Instead, she walked to her quarters, mentally preparing for the next day, the day she would confront the colonel on her own terms. She knew she had one opportunity to show him who she really was, to make him understand that her pace was not laziness, and that her dedication was not in question. The base seemed unusually quiet that evening, almost as if it too was holding its breath. Soldiers returned from training, officers completed paperwork, and the wind carried a chill through the empty corridors. Elena sat on her bunk, removed her boots, and flexed her sore feet. Her hand brushed against the bandage beneath her uniform, a reminder of what she had endured overseas, a silent, painful testament to her service. Her thoughts drifted back to the convoy ambush. The explosion, the chaos, the desperate scramble to shield the young private from the shrapnel that tore through her side. She had survived, but not without consequence. Multiple surgeries, months of recovery, nerve damage, each a quiet scar she carried with pride and discretion. She didn't speak of it. She didn't flaunt her sacrifice. It was hers and hers alone. Tomorrow she would reveal the truth, but not as a plea for sympathy. She would show the colonel what discipline, courage, and resilience really looked like. And when he saw her wound, when he saw the proof of what she had given for her country, she hoped he would finally see her, not as an excuse maker, but as a soldier who had already faced the battlefield and returned with honor intact. For now, all she could do was rest, gather her strength, and prepare for the confrontation. Outside, the wind whistled across the barracks, a reminder that life on base demanded vigilance and resilience. And Captain Elena Ward, though weary and in pain, was ready to face it head-on. The sun had just begun to climb above the horizon at Fort Braxton, casting a pale orange glow across the frost-dusted barracks. The morning's harsh PT session still lingered in the soldiers' muscles, a reminder of Colonel Briggs' unforgiving standards. In the mess hall, voices were hushed, though curiosity buzzed like an electric current. Everyone who had witnessed the colonel's public reprimand of Captain Elena Ward wanted answers. Soldiers whispered in small groups, exchanging speculative glances. "Who is she?" asked Private Andrews, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, we all saw what happened on the field. She barely moved and Briggs tore into her like she committed treason." Sergeant Diaz, ever observant, leaned against a table nearby, listening. He had served long enough to recognize the signs. When Briggs singled someone out, it was never personal. But in this case, something about Elena Ward had unsettled even the colonel, and that didn't happen often. Diaz quietly interjected, "It's not what you think. She's not avoiding PT because she's lazy. There's more to it, trust me." Private Andrews raised an eyebrow. "More to it? Come on, Sergeant. I've seen soldiers make excuses before. This doesn't feel like that." Diaz shook his head. "No, there's a reason she moves that way, a reason she doesn't argue back. I've seen that look before, the kind that hides pain, not weakness." The rumors spread faster than wildfire. By mid-morning, nearly every soldier on base had heard about the confrontation. Some assumed she had pulled strings to avoid full PT. Others speculated she had suffered some injury in her previous deployment. Most just whispered, unsure of what to believe. For Elena, it didn't matter what they thought. She didn't seek validation from her peers. She only sought a chance to serve without being misjudged. Meanwhile, Colonel Briggs was packing in his office, a frown etched deep across his face. He had prided himself on running a tight, disciplined unit, one in which every soldier answered directly to his standards. Yet Alina Ward had shaken that routine in a way that was both irritating and confusing. Normally, soldiers either fell in line or made excuses and faced consequences. This was different. She hadn't protested. She hadn't argued. She had stood her ground quietly, without a hint of fear or disrespect. He tapped his fingers on the edge of his desk, his mind replaying the morning. There was something about the way she had held herself, the calmness in her eyes, that suggested she had endured hardship far beyond what most soldiers experienced. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to pride or arrogance. But as he looked over the reports she had filed during her overseas assignment, he noticed something unsettling. Her name appeared in multiple commendations, none of which mentioned any complaint about injury or hardship. She had simply done her duty, quietly and without fanfare. Across the base, Alina was preparing herself for the next day's meeting with Briggs. She moved carefully through the barracks, aware of the stares and whispers following her. Soldiers who had once avoided eye contact now offered subtle nods of acknowledgement. She smiled faintly but kept her distance. She didn't want attention, only the opportunity to prove her capability and to make the colonel understand why she had moved at a modified pace. Later that evening, Sergeant Diaz found her sitting quietly on the edge of her bunk, the weight of the day etched on her face. "Captain," he began, carefully lowering himself onto the floor, "you could tell him about your injury, you know. You don't have to wait until he thinks you're slacking. He'll listen if you show him the truth." Alina shook her head. "It's not about forcing him to listen, Sergeant. It's about showing him the reality. My injury isn't an excuse. It's proof of what I've already endured. I don't want sympathy. I want respect earned through action, not through pity." Diaz nodded slowly, recognizing the determination in her eyes. "I get that, but you need to be careful. Briggs doesn't forgive mistakes easily, and this isn't the type of thing you can sugarcoat. If you want him to understand, you need to be direct, firm, and prepared for resistance." Alina's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the base lay silent under the soft light of the evening sky. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a cold, almost premonitory edge. She flexed her fingers against the compression bandage beneath her uniform, a constant, subtle reminder of the injury that would soon speak louder than words ever could. Her mind replayed the moments of her deployment. The convoy ambush, the explosion, the chaotic scramble to shield a young private from the shrapnel that tore through her side. Each flashback was vivid, the smell of smoke, the screams, the desperate hands trying to save others. She had survived, but not unscathed. Multiple surgeries, nerve damage, months of grueling therapy. She had returned to duty not for recognition, but because the army was her life and serving was her identity. Diaz watched her in silence, realizing that no words could fully capture what she had endured. "You know," he said softly, "most people would break after what you went through. You just keep going." Alina gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Some of us have to, not for glory, not for medals. We do it because it's the right thing, because someone has to." The night deepened and soldiers retired to their quarters, yet the tension from the morning lingered. Alina spent the rest of the evening preparing mentally, reviewing her medical documents, and rehearsing how she would face the colonel. She didn't need to plead. She didn't need to justify herself. She needed to reveal a truth that could not be ignored, a truth written on her body and endured in silence. Meanwhile, the whispers on the base had intensified. Soldiers who had initially doubted her now watched closely, anticipating what would happen when the colonel confronted her formally. Questions swirled. Would she finally speak? Would she back down under the colonel's authority? Or would she reveal something that would leave everyone, including Briggs, stunned? Even Briggs could not fully predict what the next morning would bring. He had faced countless soldiers, from the hardened to the reckless, but something about Alina's composure unsettled him. He prided himself on reading people quickly, yet she had managed to remain an enigma. That uncertainty gnawed at him more than any insubordination ever could. By the time the base fell silent under the night sky, Alina was already asleep, muscles sore but mind sharp, heart steady. She knew tomorrow would not be ordinary. The confrontation could change the way she was perceived, and perhaps even change the colonel's understanding of leadership. It was a calculated risk, but one she was ready to take. In the quiet of her bunk, Alina allowed herself a moment of reflection. She wasn't running from the past, nor hiding her scars. She was preparing to show the colonel and the entire base that true strength was not measured by speed in PT, but by courage, resilience, and integrity. The battlefield had already tested her in ways no base could. Now it was the colonel's turn to understand. And when she stood before him, when the truth emerged, the silence that followed would speak louder than any reprimand, any accusation, or any rumor ever could. The next morning, the base seemed quieter than usual, as if every soldier sensed the storm waiting in Colonel Briggs' office. Captain Alina Ward moved through the corridors with measured steps, her boots clicking softly against the polished concrete. Her uniform was immaculate, hair tightly secured, posture perfect. She carried herself with the calm precision of a soldier who had endured far more than most could imagine. Today, however, was not about showing strength through appearances. It was about revealing the truth. Colonel Harrison Briggs sat behind his massive oak desk, papers neatly stacked, coffee steaming beside him. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, casting stripes across his stern face. He didn't glance up as Alina entered. Instead, he steepled his fingers and let the silence stretch uncomfortably. Finally, his sharp voice cut through. "Captain Ward," he said, voice tight with authority, "I trust you understand why I summoned you here." Alina nodded, her expression calm. "Yes, sir, I understand completely." Briggs leaned back slightly, scrutinizing her with piercing eyes. "I will be direct. Your behavior during PT yesterday was unacceptable. You delayed the formation, slowed others down, and, if I'm being honest, displayed a lack of discipline. I do not tolerate excuses. I am considering issuing a formal reprimand." Alina's eyes remained steady. "Sir, I respect your authority completely. I would never intentionally disrespect your leadership or shirk my responsibilities." She paused, weighing her words carefully. "I am not making an excuse, Colonel. I simply ask that you allow me to explain something before you take further action." Briggs' eyebrows furrowed, a flicker of irritation passing over his face. "Explain something. Captain, I've heard enough excuses for a lifetime. If you have a medical clearance, that's all the documentation I need. This isn't a debate about paperwork. You are expected to meet the standards of your unit." Alina inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "Sir, this isn't paperwork, it's about reality. I don't expect sympathy. I don't want to bypass the standards. I only ask you to see the truth." Briggs leaned forward now, his fingers tapping impatiently on the desk. "The truth? Captain, I've been in this army longer than you've been alive. I've seen all kinds of truths, and most are convenient excuses for failure. I suggest you speak plainly or remain silent." Alina nodded once, deliberately. She knew there was no room for hesitation, no room for half-truths. She stood straight, unflinching, and slowly reached behind her, gripping the hem of her PT coat. Briggs watched her with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "And what exactly are you going to do, Captain?" he asked, voice sharp. "You're not excused from accountability. I suggest you refrain from theatrics." She met his gaze. "Sir, may I show you something?" Briggs' eyes narrowed. The office seemed to tighten around them. "Show me what, Captain? Your excuses, your paperwork." "No, sir," Alina replied. "The truth itself." She carefully unzipped her coat, the sound sharp in the silent office. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Briggs' frown deepened, suspicion flaring in his eyes. Then she removed the coat entirely, revealing the thick compression bandage wrapped across her right side. It ran diagonally from her ribs to her lower torso, the edges tucked neatly under her uniform. The office fell silent. Briggs' hand froze mid-tap on the desk. He leaned forward slightly, trying to reconcile the image before him with the captain he had scolded only yesterday. What is this?" he asked, voice unexpectedly unsteady. Alina took a measured breath. "This, sir, is the result of an IED explosion I encountered during my last deployment. 6 months ago, our convoy was ambushed. A young private new to combat was in the blast radius. I threw myself in front of him to shield him from shrapnel." Her voice was calm even, but every word carried the weight of her experience. "I was medevaced immediately, underwent multiple surgeries, and endured months of therapy. I returned to duty as soon as I was medically cleared." Briggs' expression shifted, disbelief flickering in his eyes. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, struggling for words. He had seen injuries, war wounds, soldiers returned from the front lines, but the quiet dignity in Alina's posture, her calm acceptance of what she endured, struck him differently. There was no dramatics, no self-pity, only unwavering resolve. You didn't tell me," he finally muttered, voice low, almost uncertain. "I didn't think I needed to, sir," Alina replied evenly. "This isn't an excuse. I am fully committed to my duties, even if my recovery is ongoing. I only ask that my limitations be understood, not judged." Briggs leaned back in his chair, his usual rigid composure slipping for the first time in years. He studied her, truly studying her for the first time, seeing the scars, the bandages, the subtle stiffness in her movement. And more than that, he saw the soldier behind the uniform, the courage, the selflessness, and the resilience. The silence stretched between them, heavy and loaded with unspoken recognition. Briggs finally spoke, voice quieter than usual, almost reflective. "Captain Ward, I misjudged you." Alina inclined her head slightly, letting the words settle. "I understand, sir. I do not seek forgiveness. I only hope you see me as I am, not as someone making excuses, but as a soldier who has already faced the battlefield and returned." Briggs ran a hand across his forehead, the stern mask he wore every day slipping further. He had prided himself on discipline and accountability, on separating personal sentiment from duty. Yet here was a soldier who had lived, and nearly died, through the realities of combat, showing him the limits of both paper and protocol. His mind replayed the morning's confrontation, the harsh words, the assumptions. He had failed to see her sacrifice. "Captain," he said finally, his tone softening, I will need to review your medical documents again, and perhaps reconsider my approach to PT standards for someone of your condition." His eyes lifted to meet hers. "You've given me a lesson I did not expect." Alina nodded, her expression serene. "I do not wish to teach lessons, sir. I wish only to serve and to be judged fairly." Briggs' gaze lingered on her, a mixture of respect, guilt, and a dawning realization. He had always believed discipline and leadership were defined by compliance and strict adherence to rules. Yet here was a soldier whose strength transcended the surface measures he valued. He realized that courage, resilience, and commitment often exist beyond the metrics of PT scores and punctuality. The tension in the room slowly dissipated. Briggs gestured to a chair. "Sit. Let's discuss your recovery, your duties, and what is feasible moving forward. I want to understand fully." Alina sat, maintaining her composure, aware that this conversation could alter not only the colonel's perception of her, but also the culture of respect and understanding on the base. As she began explaining her medical limitations, detailing the modifications she could safely endure during PT, Briggs listened, truly listened. The rigid colonel who had berated her just yesterday was now attentive, taking notes, asking questions. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, but one that spoke volumes to Alina. Outside the office, the hum of the base continued as usual, unaware of the transformation happening inside. A single conversation, a moment of honesty, had begun to bridge the gap between authority and experience, between judgment and understanding. And for Alina, it marked the first step in not only earning the colonel's respect, but also shaping the perception of what it truly meant to serve and endure. By the time the discussion ended, Briggs leaned back, a measured sigh escaping him. "Captain Ward, I see now that I have underestimated you. I hope you understand that it is not easy for me to admit this." Elena's expression remained calm, almost unreadable, though there was a flicker of relief in her eyes. "Sir, I understand completely. I only ask for fairness, and I appreciate your willingness to listen." Briggs nodded slowly, a rare softness in his eyes. "You've given me more to think about than you realize, Captain. Rest assured, I will act accordingly." As Elena left the office, moving through the corridor with quiet grace, whispers among soldiers began anew. This time, however, they were tinged with admiration rather than speculation. Something had changed. Something had shifted. And though no one outside knew the details, they sensed that Captain Elena Ward was a soldier who carried more than just her uniform. She carried courage, sacrifice, and a truth that demanded recognition. For the first time in weeks, the captain allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The battle for understanding had begun, and this time she would not be silenced. After Captain Elena Ward left the office, Colonel Harrison Briggs remained seated, staring at the empty doorway. The morning sun, streaming through the blinds, cast a pattern of light across his desk, but he barely noticed it. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the image of her removing her coat, the thick bandage across her ribs, and the calm dignity in her eyes. It wasn't just a scar. It was a story, a testament to courage and sacrifice he had never considered in the sterile logic of regulations and standards. Briggs' hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, but he set it down again without taking a sip. He had faced countless soldiers over the years, some reckless, some hardened by battle, and yet none had ever left him as unsettled as Elena Ward had. His mind wandered back to the first moment she stepped forward in formation, the measured way she moved, and the subtle stiffness in her stride. At first, he had assumed laziness or insubordination. Now he understood how wrong he had been. The colonel stood abruptly, packing the length of his office. His boots echoed against the floor as he ran a hand over his face, trying to reconcile the rigid principles he upheld with the undeniable truth before him. Discipline and accountability were pillars of his command, but what he had just witnessed transcended those pillars. This was not a matter of compliance or paperwork. It was a measure of resilience, courage, and the human cost of service. Briggs opened Elena's file for the first time in detail, scanning the medical reports, deployment records, and commendations. Each document confirmed what she had revealed: multiple surgeries, nerve damage, weeks in intensive therapy, and a bravery that had gone largely unnoticed. She had not sought attention or special treatment. She had endured silently, returning to duty not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. He sat back heavily in his chair, the weight of realization pressing on him. For so long, he had equated leadership with strictness, authority with unquestionable judgment. And yet here was a soldier who embodied the essence of service more profoundly than any rigid metric could capture. He realized that his failure had been not just in judgment, but in empathy, a failure to see the person beyond the uniform, the sacrifice behind the performance. Briggs' thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Sergeant Diaz entered, cautious yet aware of the tension in the office. "Colonel, Sit, Diaz," Briggs said without looking up. "You've known Captain Ward longer than I have. Tell me, what am I missing?" Diaz sat, hands folded, his eyes meeting the colonel's with quiet honesty. "Sir, Captain Ward isn't what you think. She's disciplined, committed, and precise. But she carries wounds that don't show unless you're looking for them. That morning when you reprimanded her, you saw only the surface. There's a story beneath that, one she hasn't needed to tell anyone." Briggs nodded slowly. "I saw it today, Diaz. When she removed her coat," he paused, words failing him. "I've never seen a soldier present themselves with such dignity after sustaining such damage. I misjudged her entirely." Diaz nodded knowingly. "She's not looking for special treatment, sir. She wants to serve, to be judged on her ability, not her injury. That's why she doesn't argue or explain herself. She waits for the moment when she can show what she's capable of. Briggs leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. The weight of authority had never felt so heavy. He had prided himself on creating an environment of strict discipline, one where excuses were punished and performance was absolute. Yet Alina Ward had shown him a truth that no discipline manual could teach. Strength was not only measured in endurance or speed, but in resilience, courage, and integrity. Hours passed as Briggs reviewed every detail of her record. He read the account of the convoy ambush, the IED explosion, and how she had thrown herself over a young private to protect him. He read about the surgeries, the long rehabilitation, and the quiet determination to return to duty as soon as possible. Each line reaffirmed what he had seen with his own eyes, a soldier whose courage had gone far beyond what most ever faced. Finally, he rose, moving to the window, staring out at the training grounds. Soldiers were running laps, their disciplined movements a familiar sight. Yet Briggs no longer saw them merely as numbers in formation. He saw potential, resilience, and the unseen battles each carried, just as Alina had carried hers. A knock at the door interrupted his reflection. "Colonel." "Yes," he called, voice steadier. It was his executive officer, Lieutenant Harper, who stepped in, clipboard in hand. "Sir, the unit has been discussing Captain Ward's situation. There's some unrest, some confusion about her pace during PT and her recent reprimand." Briggs turned slowly, eyes sharp. "I've seen the situation, Harper. It's no longer about discipline. This is about understanding what true resilience looks like. Captain Ward has endured more than most soldiers in this battalion could imagine, and she has returned to duty without complaint. That must be recognized." Harper's eyes widened slightly. "Sir, you mean?" Briggs nodded. "Yes, I will address the unit personally. They need to understand that strength is measured in more ways than speed or compliance. Captain Ward has earned our respect, not through words or excuses, but through her actions." By the afternoon, Briggs had called a private meeting with key officers. He instructed them on how to approach the unit, emphasizing respect for Alina Ward and the importance of recognizing the sacrifices soldiers make, visible or invisible. For the first time, Briggs found himself advocating for empathy, for understanding the human element in leadership, a concept he had long dismissed as secondary to discipline. Meanwhile, word had already begun to spread among the lower ranks. Soldiers who had previously whispered rumors now spoke in tones of admiration and curiosity. Private Andrews, who had doubted her the day before, quietly observed her passing through the barracks and noticed the subtle stiffness in her movements and the quiet confidence in her gaze. He caught himself nodding in respect, realizing he had judged her unfairly. By evening, Briggs returned to his office, staring once more at the space Alina had occupied. He reflected on the lesson she had unwittingly taught him, that leadership is not only about enforcing rules, but also about understanding the sacrifices and struggles of those under your command. Alina Ward had reminded him, in the most undeniable way, that courage comes in many forms. For Alina herself, the day passed quietly. She returned to her quarters, completing routine maintenance and physical therapy exercises with precision, though every movement reminded her of the scars beneath her uniform. She did not seek recognition or praise. She only wished to serve fully and without misunderstanding. And yet, she sensed a shift. The colonel, once rigid and unyielding, had begun to see her not as an anomaly to be corrected, but as a soldier whose courage and dedication demanded respect. As night fell over Fort Braxton, the base hummed with its usual activity, unaware of the quiet transformation that had begun. Alina rested, her thoughts already preparing for the next day when she would continue her duties with renewed purpose. The colonel, sitting alone in his office, stared at the papers before him, reflecting on what he had learned. The incident had changed him, subtly but irrevocably. He realized that leadership required more than authority. It required discernment, empathy, and the ability to recognize valor in all its forms. The room was silent, but the colonel's mind was alive with thought. For the first time, he considered the real cost of service, the invisible burdens his soldiers carried, and the quiet heroism that often went unnoticed. Captain Alina Ward had revealed more than a wound. She had revealed the essence of true strength, the kind that commands respect without demanding it. As he finally stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the formation grounds bathed in the evening light, Briggs knew that the morning's events would have a lasting impact, not just on his perception of Alina Ward, but on the entire battalion. The lesson she had imparted silently, through courage and integrity, would shape the way he led from that day forward. And somewhere across the base, Alina Ward rested, unaware of the storm of respect and reflection she had unleashed. Her wound was visible, yes, but her strength, quiet and unwavering, was what truly left a mark, one that would resonate far beyond the walls of the colonel's office. The sun had barely risen over Fort Braxton when Colonel Harrison Briggs found himself walking purposefully toward the medical unit. The crisp morning air bit at his cheeks, but he hardly noticed. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the previous day. Captain Alina Ward's quiet dignity, her scars, and the story behind them had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of misjudgment heavy on his shoulders, and he knew that something had to change. Briggs pushed open the doors of the medical unit, startling a few nurses who were accustomed to the colonel's usual formal visits. "Colonel Briggs," Nurse Reynolds greeted him cautiously, "what brings you here so early?" "I need to review Captain Ward's recovery status," he said, his voice firm but carrying an unusual undertone of concern. "I want a detailed understanding of her current limitations and the timeline for full rehabilitation." The nurses exchanged subtle glances, surprised by the colonel's unusual request. Briggs rarely checked on the personal medical details of his soldiers himself. He usually relied on summaries from his staff, never showing this level of personal involvement. Reynolds guided him to the records room, handing him a thick folder of documents. Briggs scanned through the reports, each page reinforcing what he had already seen. Multiple surgeries, nerve damage, weeks in intensive physical therapy, and a slow, painstaking process of recovery. Each line made him more aware of the bravery and determination required just to survive, let alone return to duty. "Colonel, are you sure you want to go through these details yourself?" Reynolds asked. "Most of this is confidential, and it's not usually necessary for commanding officers to review every step of a soldier's recovery." Briggs nodded, barely looking up. "I need to understand, not for protocol, but to comprehend the reality of what she has endured. I misjudged her yesterday, and I must ensure that such misjudgment does not occur again." As he flipped through the records, he felt a growing respect and a sharp pang of guilt. He realized that he had allowed his strict adherence to rules to blind him to the very qualities he prided himself on fostering in his soldiers: courage, resilience, and integrity. Alina Ward had silently carried the weight of a battlefield wound while maintaining the highest standards of duty. He had failed to see her for what she truly was. By late morning, Briggs returned to his office, the folder of documents under his arm. He paced the room, weighing his next steps carefully. He knew he had to act, not just to rectify his personal error, but to set an example for the entire battalion. Soldiers had already whispered rumors about Alina, some doubting her commitment. Others were quietly admiring her but unsure how to express it. The colonel's acknowledgement could change the perception across the base. He called a meeting with the key officers of the battalion, including Sergeant Diaz, Lieutenant Harper, and several others who oversaw daily PT routines. Briggs' tone was uncharacteristically reflective. "Captain Alina Ward has demonstrated a level of bravery, resilience, and integrity that far exceeds what I initially observed. I misjudged her." The officers looked at one another in surprise, aware that Briggs rarely admitted mistakes publicly, let alone to his staff. Briggs continued, "It is my responsibility as a commanding officer to ensure that such courage is recognized appropriately. Captain Ward's injury does not define her ability. Her commitment and service do. I expect all of you to treat her with the respect she has earned and to adjust PT expectations accordingly, within medical guidance, of course." Diaz nodded quietly, relief and pride in his eyes. "Sir, Captain Ward will appreciate that approach. She's always preferred to lead by example rather than seek recognition." Briggs allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Good. And further, I want you to observe her recovery program closely. There is much to learn from her experience, not just about rehabilitation, but about leadership under duress. I intend to incorporate her insights into the training regimen for all returning soldiers." Meanwhile, word of the colonel's change in demeanor began to circulate unofficially through the base. Soldiers who had been skeptical or dismissive of Alina's presence started to take notice. Private Andrews, who had previously questioned her abilities, watched her as she passed in the corridor, noting the quiet precision with which she moved despite the lingering stiffness in her side. Others began to ask subtle questions, hoping to understand her secret, her strength. By mid-afternoon, Alina herself was unaware of the full extent of the shift occurring around her. She went about her duties as usual, conducting routine PT modifications for soldiers in recovery, demonstrating exercises carefully, and offering quiet guidance. She was unaware that the colonel had already addressed the officers and that whispers of respect and admiration were spreading like wildfire. Later, Sergeant Diaz approached her quietly in the training yard. "Captain," he said softly, "you might not realize this, but things are changing. The colonel, he's seeing you differently. The unit, they're noticing too." Alina tilted her head slightly, a calm expression on her face. "I don't need attention, Sergeant. I only need to serve effectively. Recognition is secondary to duty." Diaz shook his head with a small smile. "Maybe for you, but others need to see the example you set. It's teaching them more than any lecture ever could." That evening, Briggs sat in his office again, reviewing the battalion's PT logs and Alina's progress notes. He reflected on his previous approach to leadership, his rigid focus on compliance and discipline, and realized how narrow his perspective had been. Leadership was not merely enforcing rules. It was understanding the human elements behind performance, recognizing bravery, and acknowledging sacrifice. Alina Ward had demonstrated all of these qualities, not through words or protests, but through action and courage. He drafted a memo to be read at the next company assembly, one that would subtly acknowledge Alina's contribution without drawing unnecessary attention to her injury. It would be an affirmation of respect, a teaching moment for the entire unit. For Briggs, this was not about praise or awards. It was about correcting his own failure to see what truly mattered in a soldier. Across the base, Alina's influence quietly expanded. Soldiers who once doubted her now sought her guidance in rehabilitation exercises, watched her for cues on packing and endurance, and silently admired her determination. The whispers that had been skeptical and judgmental now carried tones of admiration, curiosity, and respect. Her quiet dignity was reshaping the culture of understanding on the base. That night, as the barracks settled into silence, Alina sat quietly, reflecting on the day. She had faced the colonel, revealed her truth, and yet had done so without drama or complaint. The weight of her wound remained, both physically and emotionally, but she felt a subtle shift in the energy around her. The colonel's recognition, though private for now, was beginning to ripple outward. The soldiers were starting to understand what she had carried, and what it meant to persevere without expectation of acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Briggs remained awake long after the sun had set, the folder of Alina's records open before him. He thought about the soldiers under his command, about the countless ways strength manifested in unexpected forms. He realized that discipline and leadership were not mutually exclusive with empathy, and that his understanding of both had been limited until this moment. Alina Ward had taught him a lesson he would not soon forget, and it would shape the way he led the battalion from that day forward. By the time the base lights dimmed and the night settled in, a subtle change had taken place. The colonel's mindset had shifted, the soldiers' perception of Alina had evolved, and the foundations of respect and understanding were quietly being laid. Captain Alina Ward, unaware of the full scope of her impact, rested peacefully, confident in her service and quietly proud of the small ripple of change she had begun. The morning would bring more challenges, more interactions, and more moments to prove her capabilities. But for now, a single act of courage, revealed with dignity and clarity, had begun to reshape the culture of Fort Braxton. And Colonel Briggs, for the first time, understood that leadership required more than authority. It required recognition of strength in all its forms, visible and invisible. The morning at Fort Braxton began with the usual hum of activity, but there was an unmistakable tension and curiosity in the air. Soldiers lined up for PT, some casting glances toward Captain Alina Ward, who moved with quiet purpose toward the training yard. There was no fanfare, no announcements, yet her presence commanded attention. The recent events with Colonel Briggs had begun to shift perceptions. Whispers of admiration replaced doubt, and the soldiers waited to see how she would conduct herself. Alina carried herself with the same calm precision as always, adjusting her coat and stretching her arms methodically before beginning exercises. Sergeant Diaz, watching from the side, noted the subtle difference in the unit's energy. Soldiers were more attentive, more cautious not out of fear, but out of respect. Even Private Andrews, who had been skeptical from the start, now observed her with keen interest, recognizing the quiet authority she exuded. "All right, everyone," Alina called out, her voice firm but not harsh. "We'll begin today with a series of modified drills. Safety first, form second, pace yourselves. Remember, PT is about discipline and endurance, not just speed." The soldiers exchanged glances, then complied, falling into formation. Alina led by example, moving with careful precision, demonstrating each exercise herself. Though her movements were slightly slower due to the injury still healing beneath her uniform, every motion was controlled, purposeful, and precise. It was a silent testament to her discipline, showing the soldiers that even when facing limitations, determination and technique mattered more than brute speed. Colonel Briggs, observing from the sidelines, felt a mixture of pride and awe. The same soldier he had scolded just days earlier was now quietly shaping the unit's culture. He realized that leadership wasn't about issuing commands or enforcing compliance. It was about example, influence, and showing others what was possible even under challenging circumstances. As the morning progressed, Alina moved among the soldiers, offering guidance and correcting form, but always with encouragement rather than criticism. Her eyes caught those of Private Andrews, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod as he adjusted his posture. The gesture carried more weight than any words could have. It was acknowledgement of effort, recognition of diligence, and a subtle reinforcement of respect. Sergeant Diaz approached her briefly. "Captain, they're really responding to you today. You've set a tone that the entire unit is picking up on. Even the colonel seems different, more aware, I think." Alina nodded, though her expression remained composed. "I don't need attention, Sergeant. I only want to ensure that we all maintain discipline while respecting the limitations each soldier carries. Leadership is responsibility, not ego." By mid-morning, the subtle shift was undeniable. Soldiers moved with greater focus, supporting one another, helping those struggling to keep pace. Alina observed quietly, intervening only when necessary. Her quiet authority had replaced fear or doubt with respect and inspiration. The morale of the unit was visibly improving, and the sense of cohesion among soldiers had strengthened. Colonel Briggs could not help but notice the transformation. He had expected discipline to falter in the presence of modified PT, but instead, the unit thrived. Alina's influence created a ripple effect. Soldiers who had once questioned her now sought her guidance, and even the most skeptical began to model their conduct after her example. During a brief break, Briggs approached Alina, observing her calmly adjusting the bandage beneath her uniform before resuming exercises. "Captain," he said quietly, "I want to commend you, not just for enduring your recovery but for the way you're leading this unit. You're teaching them more than drills ever could." Alina glanced up, offering a small nod. "Thank you, sir. I only hope they learn to respect themselves and each other as much as their duties." The rest of the morning continued with structured drills, but Alina incorporated elements that challenged both endurance and teamwork. Soldiers were paired for exercises, requiring them to support one another physically and mentally. The exercises were demanding, but under her guidance, they felt achievable. Alina's quiet encouragement and the demonstration of her own controlled strength inspired them to push through fatigue without overexerting themselves. By the end of the session, the soldiers were breathing heavily, muscles burning but spirits lifted. They gathered near the water station, talking quietly among themselves. Private Andrews approached Sergeant Diaz. "Sir, I didn't think I'd say this, but Captain Ward, she's incredible. Even with the injury, she outpaces half the unit in focus and determination." Diaz nodded with a knowing smile. "It's not just focus, Andrews, it's discipline, patience, and leadership. She's showing everyone how to push themselves without risking harm. That's rare." Alina walked past them quietly, overhearing only fragments of conversation. She didn't comment or seek acknowledgement. Her satisfaction came from knowing the unit was learning, growing, and understanding that strength came in many forms, not just speed, not just endurance, but courage, resilience, and integrity. Later that afternoon, Colonel Briggs convened a small meeting with the unit's officers. "Captain Ward has set an example that should be studied and emulated," he said, tone firm. "Her actions today have shown that true leadership is about more than issuing commands. It's about understanding the human element in every soldier under your charge." The officers nodded, absorbing the unusual but important lesson. Leadership, Briggs explained, required recognizing strength in all forms, not just the visible, measurable kind. Alina's example had reshaped their perspective, highlighting courage, dedication, and quiet resilience. Back in the barracks, Alina completed her own physical therapy exercises with precision, careful not to aggravate her injury while maintaining the standard of discipline she demanded of herself. She didn't boast, didn't seek recognition. She only prepared to return to duty fully capable, knowing her actions had already left a lasting impression on the soldiers around her. As evening fell, the unit gathered for roll call, and a quiet energy had settled over the formation. Soldiers stood straighter, walked with purpose, and exchanged glances of respect and camaraderie. The whispers of doubt had been replaced with admiration, and even the most hardened soldiers now regarded Alina with a mix of awe and respect. Colonel Briggs watched from the sidelines, reflecting on the lessons learned over the past few days. He realized that his initial scolding of Alina had been a failure not of discipline, but of perception. He had judged her by appearances, assuming laziness where there was resilience, questioning commitment where there was courage. And in doing so, he had underestimated the impact one soldier could have on the morale and culture of an entire unit. For Alina, the day ended quietly but with an unspoken sense of accomplishment. She had led not through intimidation but through example, not through authority but through action. She had shown her fellow soldiers the meaning of resilience, the value of patience, and the importance of integrity. And she had done it while quietly managing her own pain, her own recovery, her own burden. That night, as the barracks settled into silence, Sergeant Diaz approached Alina one last time. "Captain," he said softly, "you've done more than PT today. You've changed how this unit thinks, how they respect each other, and even how the colonel views leadership. Not everyone can do that." Alina smiled faintly, her expression calm. "It isn't about recognition, Sergeant. It's about showing what's possible when duty, courage, and respect guide every action. That's all anyone needs to learn. As the lights dimmed and the base fell quiet, the impact of Alina Ward's presence was undeniable. The soldiers had witnessed a demonstration of courage, resilience, and leadership that would ripple through the unit long after the day's exercises ended. And for Colonel Briggs, the lesson was even deeper. Authority alone was not enough to lead effectively. True leadership required understanding, empathy, and the recognition of the quiet heroism that often went unnoticed. In the stillness of the night, both officer and soldier rested, aware that the events of the day had begun a transformation, one that would leave an enduring mark on Fort Braxton. And at the heart of it all was Captain Alina Ward, quietly demonstrating that strength, courage, and integrity could inspire far more than discipline alone ever could. The following morning at Fort Braxton carried a weight of anticipation. Soldiers filed onto the parade grounds, boots scuffing against the concrete, forming neat lines under the watchful eye of Colonel Briggs. The previous days had been quietly transformative, with Alina Ward leading by example, demonstrating the strength of resilience, courage, and precision. Rumors and whispers had shifted from skepticism to admiration, and today, Briggs intended to address the entire battalion, not merely to acknowledge Alina, but to convey a larger lesson in leadership and respect. Alina stood quietly at the edge of formation, her bandaged side hidden beneath her uniform, posture straight, eyes forward. She did not seek attention. Her presence alone was commanding. Soldiers who had doubted her days before now watched intently, noticing the calm authority she carried and the subtle strength in her movements. Even those who had been indifferent were now curious, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Colonel Briggs stepped forward, his usual stern expression softened by a sense of reflection. He raised a hand, calling the formation to attention. "Soldiers of Fort Braxton," he began, voice carrying firmly across the parade grounds. "We have learned in the past few days an important lesson about courage, resilience, and leadership." A murmur ran through the formation. Soldiers exchanged glances, anticipating what the colonel would say next. Even Sergeant Diaz felt a subtle thrill. He had seen the way Alina's example had already reshaped the unit's morale, and now it was being acknowledged formally. Briggs continued, "We often judge performance by appearances, speed in PT, strict adherence to routine, or physical capability. While these are important, they are not the only measures of strength. True courage is demonstrated in adversity, in sacrifice, and in unwavering commitment. Captain Alina Ward has shown this in abundance." The soldiers stiffened in attention, their eyes now on Alina. She remained calm, eyes forward, not looking at the colonel or the crowd. The shift in energy was palpable. Whispers of curiosity had been replaced with awe and respect. Briggs gestured toward her. Captain Ward was injured in combat while protecting her unit from harm. She endured multiple surgeries, nerve damage, and grueling rehabilitation, yet she returned to duty without complaint, without seeking sympathy, and without allowing her condition to compromise her commitment. The parade grounds were silent. Soldiers absorbed the weight of his words, realizing the significance of what they had only partially glimpsed in whispers. Alina's quiet determination had become a lesson for all of them, one that transcended physical performance or rank. Briggs paused for a moment, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle. Her example teaches us that leadership is not only about authority or compliance. It is about understanding, empathy, and recognizing the hidden burdens carried by those around us. It is about resilience, courage, and the quiet heroism that often goes unnoticed. Alina's eyes shifted slightly, acknowledging the colonel's words without turning toward him fully. She felt the eyes of the battalion upon her, and though she did not seek recognition, she understood the significance of the moment. Her silent endurance and quiet strength had become a beacon for her fellow soldiers. Briggs continued, his voice firm yet carrying a rare warmth. "I expect all of you to honor Captain Ward's example, not just in words but in action. Look beyond appearances. Support one another. Recognize courage and resilience, whether visible or hidden. And remember that leadership is about inspiring others through example, not fear or intimidation. The soldiers absorbed his words with renewed focus. The lesson was clear. Strength is not measured solely in speed, endurance, or compliance. It is found in courage, sacrifice, and integrity. Alina's example had become the standard, the benchmark against which true leadership and commitment were now measured. After the formal address, Briggs stepped back slightly, motioning for Alina to join him at the front of the formation. She moved forward gracefully, careful not to draw attention to the subtle stiffness in her movements. The colonel spoke quietly, so only she could hear. "Captain, your example has transformed this unit in ways I could not have anticipated. Your courage, discipline, and quiet determination have reshaped how we understand leadership and service." Alina inclined her head slightly, offering a small, controlled nod. "Thank you, sir. I only seek to serve and to help others recognize their own potential, regardless of limitations." Briggs gestured to the formation. "Soldiers, take note. This is how true leadership looks. Not just in orders or execution, but in the courage to endure, the discipline to persevere, and the integrity to act without expectation of recognition. Captain Ward embodies these qualities." Applause, subtle but respectful, began to ripple through the battalion. Soldiers who had doubted her, who had whispered judgment, now found themselves inspired. Private Andrews, standing rigid in formation, felt a surge of admiration for the captain who had quietly endured what none of them could imagine and continued to serve with unwavering dedication. Throughout the day, Alina's influence expanded beyond PT. Soldiers sought her guidance on physical therapy techniques, packing during exercises, and even mental resilience. She offered careful, precise instructions, demonstrating each movement with the same disciplined focus she applied to her own recovery. Her quiet authority and mastery of her craft drew the attention of officers and enlisted alike. By evening, Briggs held a small meeting with his key staff. "Captain Ward's example has reshaped the battalion," he said. "We must ensure that her lessons are integrated into training and leadership development. Her resilience, courage, and integrity should be studied and emulated. This is not just about one soldier. It is about raising the standard for all of us." Sergeant Diaz nodded, pride evident in his eyes. "Sir, I've seen soldiers actively looking for ways to emulate her example. They're asking questions, paying attention to form, and supporting each other more than ever. The morale shift is significant." Briggs allowed himself a rare smile. "Good. This is the effect of true leadership, one that inspires rather than intimidates. Captain Ward has reminded us all of that." Meanwhile, Alina quietly returned to her quarters, reflecting on the day. She had never sought recognition, yet she understood that the impact of her actions extended far beyond personal validation. Her endurance, courage, and discipline had not only changed perceptions, but had also instilled a culture of respect, empathy, and resilience within the battalion. She reviewed her recovery routine meticulously, aware that maintaining her strength and discipline was essential to continuing her role as a model for the unit. Each movement, each controlled step, was a reminder of the battlefield she had survived, the sacrifices made, and the quiet power of resilience. As night settled over Fort Braxton, soldiers gathered in small groups, reflecting on the day's lessons. The whispers of doubt that had circulated earlier in the week were gone. In their place were stories of admiration and a newfound understanding of courage and leadership. Alina Ward had become more than a soldier in their eyes. She had become a symbol of what dedication, bravery, and integrity truly looked like. Colonel Briggs remained in his office, reviewing logs and PT schedules, yet his mind kept returning to the lessons learned from Alina's example. He realized that leadership was about more than issuing orders or enforcing discipline. It was about recognizing strength, supporting resilience, and fostering an environment where courage and dedication could flourish. Alina Ward had reminded him of this truth in a way that would resonate for the rest of his career. And somewhere in the quiet of the barracks, Alina rested, not seeking applause or accolades, but satisfied in knowing that her silent example had sparked a transformation. Soldiers were learning, the colonel was learning, and the unit itself was evolving. The impact of one quiet, determined soldier was far-reaching, leaving a mark on the battalion that would endure long after the day's exercises and speeches were forgotten. For Captain Alina Ward, it was never about recognition. Yet as the stars appeared over Fort Braxton, she allowed herself a rare, small smile, understanding that courage, discipline, and integrity had spoken louder than any words ever could, and that the battalion had listened. Weeks had passed since the events that transformed Fort Braxton. Captain Alina Ward had continued her duties with the same unwavering discipline and quiet dignity, yet the impact of her example had become woven into the fabric of the battalion. Soldiers moved with a renewed sense of purpose, their morale and cohesion noticeably stronger. What had begun as whispers of curiosity and admiration had grown into a culture of respect, empathy, and determination. Alina's days were carefully structured. Morning PT still demanded precision and focus, but she now incorporated exercises that emphasized teamwork, resilience, and controlled strength. Soldiers who once doubted her now sought guidance, not only in exercises but in maintaining mental fortitude under stress. Even the most hardened veterans began to emulate her approach, calm, controlled, and consistently committed. Colonel Harrison Briggs watched all of this with a mixture of pride and humility. His initial skepticism, his rigid adherence to rules, had been replaced by a deeper understanding of leadership. He now saw firsthand that authority alone did not inspire. It was example, courage, and integrity that created lasting influence. Briggs had begun a weekly review of PT and recovery programs, ensuring that every returning soldier received recognition, guidance, and appropriate support. One morning, Briggs requested a private meeting with Alina in his office. She entered quietly, posture straight, expression calm. Briggs gestured for her to sit, his usual stern mask softened by a rare warmth. "Captain Ward," he began, "I want to formally recognize the changes you've inspired. Not because of the injury you sustained, not because of the protocols you follow, but because of your resilience, your leadership, and the example you set for everyone in this battalion. You've taught us all a lesson that goes far beyond PT, reports, and regulations." Alina inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, sir. I do not seek recognition. I only wish to serve effectively and ensure that the soldiers under my guidance understand the importance of discipline, courage, and integrity." Briggs leaned forward, his hands resting on his desk. "You have done more than serve, Captain. You've transformed the perception of leadership here. Soldiers respect you not out of fear, but because of the example you embody. That is far rarer than any medal or commendation." Alina allowed herself a faint, controlled smile. She understood the gravity of the colonel's words. Leadership was not simply about command. It was about shaping others through action, patience, and quiet authority. Her mission had always been to serve, yet the unforeseen outcome was a profound influence on her fellow soldiers and the battalion itself. Later that day, the battalion gathered for a scheduled training review. Soldiers fell into formation, their movements precise and disciplined, yet there was a distinct energy in the air, one of respect, camaraderie, and anticipation. Alina led the warm-up exercises, her presence commanding attention without a single raised voice. Even those who had been skeptical before now moved with focus, aware of the lessons embedded in every controlled movement. Private Andrews, who had been among the most doubtful, approached her during a break. "Captain, I want to thank you," he said quietly. "I didn't understand before, but watching you, seeing how you carry yourself, it's taught me more than any drill or lecture ever could." Alina nodded, her calm expression betraying none of the satisfaction she felt. "Thank you, Private. The most important thing is not what you see in me, but what you choose to carry forward yourself. Leadership, courage, and integrity are not given, they are cultivated. Across the field, Briggs observed, noting how the soldiers interacted with Alina and with one another. He realized that her influence was no longer confined to her presence alone. It had spread, reshaping attitudes, behaviors, and expectations. The culture of Fort Braxton had shifted, and the change was enduring. Soldiers who had once whispered judgments now discussed strategies, recovery techniques, and teamwork, inspired by her example. That evening, Briggs addressed the officers of the battalion. "Captain Ward has shown us the value of empathy, discipline, and courage," he said. "Her actions demonstrate that leadership is not only about enforcing rules, but about recognizing the hidden burdens carried by those we command. We must ensure that every soldier understands this principle, and that we, as leaders, continue to learn from her example." The officers nodded, aware that their perspective had been forever altered. Leadership was no longer about rigid authority alone. It was about observation, understanding, and modeling the qualities they wished to instill in others. Alina's quiet strength had revealed the path forward. As weeks turned into months, Alina continued to lead the battalion through PT, recovery programs, and operational training. Her bandaged side healed gradually, leaving faint but permanent scars. These marks, however, were secondary to the imprint she had left on the hearts and minds of her fellow soldiers. She had become a symbol of resilience, a tangible example that courage and integrity were not measured by appearances, but by consistent, quiet dedication. One afternoon, as Alina walked through the training grounds, she noticed soldiers assisting one another with exercises, correcting form, offering encouragement. The energy was cooperative rather than competitive, supportive rather than judgmental. She realized with quiet satisfaction that the lessons she had embodied were now embedded in the daily conduct of the battalion. Colonel Briggs approached her, a rare smile on his face. "Captain, I wanted you to see this," he said, gesturing toward the soldiers. "Your influence has created a culture of respect and teamwork. It's remarkable. You've led by example, and the results speak for themselves." Alina nodded, her calm demeanor unchanged. "Thank you, sir. The goal is not recognition. The goal is ensuring that every soldier understands that their resilience, courage, and integrity matter. That is the true measure of strength." The colonel stood quietly for a moment, reflecting. He had learned more from Alina Ward in the past months than from any manual, lecture, or directive in his long career. Her example had reshaped his understanding of leadership, empathy, and courage. And now, he realized, the battalion itself was stronger because of it. That evening, the soldiers gathered informally in the mess hall. Conversations buzzed with stories of personal challenges, shared encouragement, and mutual respect. Captain Ward moved among them quietly, observing, guiding, and occasionally offering subtle advice. Her presence was a stabilizing force, a living reminder of the values she had demonstrated: perseverance, courage, and integrity. Private Andrews approached her once more. "Captain, do you ever get tired of all this, of always having to set an example?" he asked quietly. Alina looked at him, her expression calm. "Leadership is never about convenience or comfort, Private. It is about responsibility. If my actions help even one soldier understand their potential and push themselves responsibly, then it is never tiring. It is the duty of those who serve to inspire those who follow." As night fell over Fort Braxton, the lights of the barracks reflected off the parade grounds. The soldiers rested, carrying with them the lessons of courage, resilience, and quiet leadership they had witnessed firsthand. Captain Alina Ward retired to her quarters, not seeking accolades, but quietly content in knowing that her example had made a lasting difference. Colonel Briggs, too, reflected on the transformation. The battalion was stronger, more cohesive, and more resilient. The lessons of empathy, courage, and leadership had been internalized by those he commanded. Alina Ward had done more than fulfill her duty. She had created a legacy. In the days, months, and years that followed, the story of Captain Alina Ward became quietly legendary within the unit. Soldiers recalled how a quiet, determined soldier, carrying the visible and invisible scars of battle, had reshaped their understanding of leadership. Her courage inspired promotions, improved training practices, and fostered a culture of respect that endured far beyond her time at Fort Braxton. For Alina herself, the recognition was secondary. Her satisfaction came from knowing that her actions, her example, and her quiet integrity had created change. She had faced judgment, revealed truth, and led without complaint or expectation. And in doing so, she had left a mark not only on her fellow soldiers, but on the very culture of the battalion she served. The final lesson was clear. Courage, resilience, and integrity were timeless qualities. They transcended rank, injury, and circumstance. They were the essence of leadership, and Captain Alina Ward had embodied them fully. Her legacy was not written in medals or formal accolades, but in the lives she had influenced, the culture she had reshaped, and the enduring respect she had earned. And as the stars shone over Fort Braxton that night, there was a quiet understanding throughout the barracks, the training grounds, and the colonel's office, that true strength is often silent, but its impact can echo for a lifetime.